The letter arrived with salt water still staining its edges, as though the ocean itself had tried to swallow the words before they could reach her. Maggie Hart stood in the cramped sitting room of her aunt's cottage on the outskirts of Cork, Ireland, in the spring of 1874, holding the envelope like it might dissolve between her fingers. The handwriting on the front was her brother Daniel's, unmistakable, slanting hard to the right, as though every letter was running somewhere urgent. She turned it over and noted the American postmark, Dusty Fork, Kansas Territory. She had not heard from Daniel in 14 months, and during those 14 months she had worked her aunt's laundry business, ironed other people's fine clothes, and told herself each morning that no news was simply no news, and not necessarily the worst kind. She was wrong. She sat down before she opened it, which was lucky, because when she read the words inside, Maggie, I am not well and I need you, but more than me you need to come because there is a man here and his name is Marshall Sawyer, and I have promised him something I had no right to promise without asking you first. Her legs went to water beneath her. The letter went on for 3 full pages. Daniel, it turned out, had been gravely ill with a fever the previous winter, the kind that had killed 3 other men in the same rooming house. A neighbor, a cattle rancher by the name of Marshall Sawyer, had sat with him through the worst of the nights, had brought the doctor twice on his own dollar, and had in some half-delirious state of gratitude, Daniel had apparently told Marshall that his sister back in Ireland was the finest, most capable, most warm-hearted woman in the known world, and that if Marshall was still unattached by summer, well, Daniel would see what he could do. Maggie read that part twice, then a 3rd time. Then she set the letter down, walked into the small kitchen, poured herself a cup of very cold water from the earthenware jug, drank it in one long swallow, and said aloud to no one in particular, Daniel Patrick Hart, you absolute fool. But she read the rest of the letter, and the rest of the letter was different. Daniel had recovered slowly through January and into February, and Marshall Sawyer had continued to check on him. Not out of obligation. Daniel was clear about that, but because the man was simply built that way. He was 31 years old, he had worked cattle since he was 16. He had a small but solid ranch 2 miles east of Dusty Fork with good water and decent grazing land, and he had never married because, as Daniel wrote it, he doesn't say much about why, Maggie, but I think he is the kind of man who would rather wait for the right thing than settle for anything less. She read that line 4 more times. She was 23 years old. She had not had much occasion in Cork to meet men who were patient and particular. She had met plenty who were loud, several who were unkind, 1 or 2 who were charming in the way that meant they were also dangerous, and a considerable number who had simply never thought very hard about anything at all. The idea of a man who would wait for what was right rather than reach for what was convenient struck her as either very romantic or very suspicious, and she spent 3 days deciding which. On the 4th day she wrote back to Daniel and told him she was coming. Her aunt wept. Her neighbors thought she had lost her mind. The priest at the parish church on Sunday looked at her with the expression of a man watching someone walk voluntarily toward a cliff's edge. Maggie thanked all of them for their concern, sold the 2 small pieces of jewelry her mother had left her, accepted a loan from her aunt which she swore on her mother's memory she would repay, and in the last week of April she packed everything she owned into 1 large trunk and 1 smaller bag, and she took the train to Queenstown and boarded a steamship bound for New York. The ocean crossing took 11 days. She spent the first 2 of them so sick over the railing that she was fairly certain she was going to die, and she spent the remaining 9 staring out at the water and wondering what sort of woman crossed an entire ocean on the strength of her brother's word and a paragraph in a letter about a man she had never met. A foolish woman, perhaps, or a brave one. She decided, somewhere around the 7th day when the sea calmed and the sky opened up into a shocking shade of blue she had never seen over Cork, that brave and foolish were more alike than most people admitted. New York was enormous and loud and smelled of fish and coal smoke and something else she could not name. She spent one night in a boarding house near the docks that a woman on the ship, a German grandmother named Elsa, had told her was safe and clean. It was neither particularly safe nor particularly clean, but it was affordable, and the next morning Maggie got herself to Penn Station and bought a ticket for the train west. She sat in the hard wooden seat of the third-class car with her large trunk stored beneath and her smaller bag on her lap, and she watched the city give way to towns, and the towns give way to countryside, and the countryside gradually shift and stretch until it became something she had no frame of reference for whatsoever. The plains of Kansas were nothing like Ireland. Ireland was green and close and folded in on itself, hills pressing against hills, the sky always near and usually gray. The Kansas prairie in late spring was the opposite of everything she had ever known, flat and enormous and golden brown, and so wide open that the sky seemed to stretch in every direction without end, pressing down on a world that offered nothing to stop it. It should have felt terrible. Instead, sitting on the train with her face against the dusty window, Maggie felt something she had not expected at all. She felt like she could breathe. Dusty Fork was a small town, though it considered itself otherwise. It had one main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass, a general store, a livery stable, a hotel with 6 rooms, a saloon that she had been warned about in the letter, a church under ongoing construction that had apparently been under ongoing construction for 3 years, a post office that also served as the telegraph office, a blacksmith, a doctor's office, and a barber shop. It had perhaps 300 residents within the town itself, and several dozen more on the ranches and farmsteads scattered across the surrounding country. The train did not stop at Dusty Fork. It stopped at a larger town called Hennessy, 12 miles west, and from there Maggie hired a wagon driver, a laconic man of about 60 named Pete who communicated almost exclusively in single-syllable sounds, to take her the rest of the way. The ride took the better part of 2 hours on a road that was more suggestion than fact, a pair of wheel ruts pressed into the grass by the passage of enough wagons over enough years to constitute a general understanding. The sun was going down behind them, and the sky ahead turned color in ways that caught Maggie entirely off guard, deep orange, fading up through red, and pink into a purple blue that she had never imagined a sky could actually be. She sat on the wagon seat next to Pete, who said nothing, and stared at the horizon, and thought that if the land was going to be this beautiful, maybe she had not made such a bad bargain after all. Daniel was waiting on the porch of his rooming house when Pete's wagon rolled down the main street of Dusty Fork. He looked thinner than she remembered, and older, and the sight of him made her throat close up in a way that had nothing to do with dust. She was down from the wagon before Pete had fully stopped it, and Daniel came off the porch steps in 4 strides, and they met in the middle of the street and held on to each other for a long moment while Pete watched with the expression of a man who had seen everything and was no longer moved by any of it. "You actually came," Daniel said into her hair. "You actually thought I would not," she said into his shoulder. "I wasn't sure. I wasn't sure what I was doing when I wrote that letter, Maggie." I was still half out of my head from the fever. She stepped back and looked at him properly. He was 26. 2 years younger than her own 1 year ago self, if that made any sense at all, which it did not. He was still handsome in the untidy way of their father, dark-haired and long-faced, and with their mother's eyes, which were a complicated shade of green that changed depending on the light. He looked better than she had feared, but worse than she had hoped, and she could see in the way he held himself a slight stiffness in the right side, a careful way with his breathing that the fever had left some damage that had not yet fully healed. "You look terrible," she told him. "You look beautiful," he said, "but you have dust in your hair." "It is the prairie, Daniel. Everything has dust in it. Where is your friend?" He did not have to ask which friend she meant. "He'll be in tomorrow morning. He doesn't know you've arrived yet exactly. I didn't know when the train was getting into Hennessy. I sent word with Tommy Aldred this afternoon, but Tommy rides like he's in no hurry." Maggie nodded. She was not sure whether she was relieved or disappointed by the delay, and she spent a good deal of the evening in the narrow room Daniel had arranged for her at the hotel trying to decide. The room had a real bed, a washstand with a ceramic pitcher and basin, a small window overlooking the main street, and a hook on the wall for her coat. It was not much. She had known considerably less, and she said her prayers over the bed that night with a feeling that was almost like gratitude, if gratitude could be tangled up with nerves. She was at breakfast in the hotel's small dining room the next morning, actual coffee, which after 11 days on a ship and 2 days on a train felt like something close to a miracle, when the door opened and Daniel came in, and behind Daniel was a man she had not yet seen. She knew it was him before Daniel said his name. He was tall, not in the exaggerated way of men who are always slightly surprised by their own height, but with the kind of easy tallness that looked like it belonged on him, like the land had made him to fit. He wore a weathered brown hat pushed back a little, a plain cotton shirt the color of dry grass, dark trousers, and boots that had seen a great deal of honest work. He was lean in the way that men are lean when their leanness is the result of actual labor, and not just the circumstance of their build. His hair was dark brown, a little long at the collar. His face was angular, square-jawed, with eyes that were the deep gray-brown of the prairie in winter. He was looking at her. She was looking at him. Daniel said, "Maggie, this is Marshall Sawyer. Marshall, this is my sister Maggie Hart." Marshall Sawyer took off his hat. He had the kind of manners that were not performed but genuine, the difference being that performed manners have a slight lag between thought and action while genuine manners simply move on their own. He took off his hat and he looked at her directly and he said, "Miss Hart, it's a real pleasure to meet you, though I wish you hadn't had to come so far." The words landed quietly, without pretension, and they were so unexpected that Maggie was silent for a moment before she found her voice. "It was not so bad," she said. "I have wanted to see the country. Have you seen enough of it to know whether it suits you?" "Not yet, but I've liked what I've seen so far." Something moved through his expression, brief and warm, like light crossing a floor. He put his hat on the table and sat down across from her when Daniel gestured to the chair. And for the next half hour the three of them had coffee and cornbread and talked carefully at first, and then less carefully, the way conversations go when everyone is paying attention and nobody is trying to perform. She learned that he had grown up in Missouri, that he had come west at 16 with a cattle drive and had never gone back, not because Missouri was bad but because Kansas had been better. He had bought his land 7 years ago, 40 acres that had grown to 80 through work and patience, with a creek that ran reliable year-round, which in Kansas was not nothing. He ran about 60 head of cattle, had 2 horses, kept a kitchen garden that he admitted freely he was not very skilled at maintaining, and had a dog named Augustus who, in Marshall's own words, considers himself the foreman of the whole operation. Maggie laughed at that. It was a real laugh, the kind she did not manufacture, and she saw the moment it hit him a small straightening, a brightness in his eyes as though the sound had landed somewhere it was not expected and was very welcome. "What do you do?" he asked her. "Back in Ireland." "Laundry. My aunt has a business, washing and ironing for the houses that can afford to pay someone else to do it." She said it plainly, without apology. She had never been ashamed of the work. "I'm good at it. I'm also good at sewing, baking, and keeping accounts, which my aunt trusted me with for the last 2 years. I taught Sunday school for a while, but I stopped when the priest and I disagreed about how to explain the book of Job to 7-year-olds. Daniel covered a laugh with a cough. Marshall looked at her steadily. "What was your position on Job?" "That God and the devil making a wager with a man's life and livestock without his knowledge is deeply unfair, and that children deserve to be told that honestly." The priest felt that was insufficiently reverent. "Sounds like an honest assessment to me." "I thought so," Maggie said. They looked at each other across the table for a moment that was perhaps 2 beats longer than necessary. And then Daniel, who was not as subtle as he believed himself to be, said something about needing to speak to the man at the livery stable and excused himself, which left them alone in the small dining room with the late morning light coming through the window. Marshall turned his hat in his hands, slow circles, and said, "I want to be straight with you, Miss Hart, because Daniel was straight with me about the situation, and I think you deserve the same. Your brother is a good man and he meant well, but I know you didn't come here under any kind of obligation. I want you to know that." "I'm not expecting anything." "What were you expecting?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I told myself to have no expectations at all, but that's not entirely true." He looked up at her. "I was hoping you might be willing to stay long enough to find out whether we suit each other. That's all. No pressure and no promises made in your name that I intend to hold you to." Maggie set down her coffee cup. "My brother wrote to me that you are a man who waits for the right thing rather than settling for anything less. Did he have that right?" "I think he was being generous. He tends toward honesty over generosity in my experience. So which is it?" Marshall held her gaze. "He had it right," she nodded slowly. "Then we understand each other. I did not cross an ocean and a prairie to be pressured, and I did not cross them to run away from something real either. I'll stay for the summer. We'll find out." He nodded once, and the corners of his mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile but was close enough to be certain that something good was happening inside it. "That seems fair," he said. They shook hands across the table. His hand was rough from work and warm, and she noticed that it was the steadiest hand she had shaken in a long time. The summer in Dusty Fork did not begin conveniently. It began, instead, with a series of ordinary and slightly difficult things that turned out, in retrospect, to be the actual architecture of something larger. The first week, Maggie took a job at the general store owned by a woman named Clara Whitfield, who was in her early 40s, brisk and efficient and fair in the way that practical women who have survived difficult circumstances tend to be fair. Clara's husband had died 3 years earlier, and she had kept the store going without apparent sentiment about the loss, though Maggie suspected, from certain pauses in Clara's speech, and the way her eyes sometimes moved toward the framed photograph behind the counter, that there was considerably more sentiment than was shown. Clara paid her a small wage and let her use the room in the back for personal things, and the work suited Maggie. She was good with numbers, good with people, good at knowing when someone had come in for more than groceries. The second week, she was invited to supper at Marshall's ranch. The ranch was called Sawyer Creek, after the water that ran through it, though Marshall himself looked slightly embarrassed by the name when she asked, as though naming a thing after yourself was a degree of self-regard he had never entirely made peace with. It had been called that when he bought it, he explained, because the man who had the land before him was also named Sawyer, and as coincidences when it had seemed like a sign, which he acknowledged was probably not a rational way to make a property decision. "Did it turn out to be a good sign?" she asked. 7 years and the creek hasn't dried up yet," he said. "I'll call that yes." The ranch house was modest but better than she had anticipated. 2 rooms, a proper stone fireplace, solid furniture that Marshall had made himself from pine, a good stove in the kitchen, and shelves along one wall of the main room that held a respectable collection of books, which she had not expected, and found herself looking at with something she recognized as the early stages of genuine admiration. A man who read in the evening, alone on a prairie, with a dog named Augustus and no one to perform it for that was not an affectation. That was simply who he was. Augustus turned out to be a large brown and white dog of indeterminate heritage who regarded Maggie with the deliberate assessment of an animal that has opinions. He sniffed her hand, walked around her once, and then leaned against her leg with the full weight of his considerable body, which Marshall said, with something that might have been relief, was the highest compliment Augustus gave. The supper was beef stew with cornbread, which Marshall cooked himself, and which was considerably better than she had braced herself for. They ate at the kitchen table with the door open to catch the evening air, and the prairie outside turned its colors as the sun went down, and Maggie found herself telling him things she had not planned to say about her mother, who had died of fever when Maggie was 15, about the laundry business and what it was really like, about the way Cork felt smaller and smaller each year, like a coat she had outgrown but was still trying to button. "Did you want to leave?" he asked. "Before Daniel's letter. Did you want to go somewhere?" She thought about it honestly. "I wanted something to be different. I wasn't sure what that meant exactly. I didn't know it meant leaving. But I think it did, yes." "What do you want now?" The question was quiet, direct, and offered without any particular agenda that she could detect. She looked at him across the supper table with the last of the evening light coming through the open door and said, "I want to find out if this is the place where I stop wanting something different and start wanting what I have." His jaw moved, something working through him that he was being careful about. "That's a good thing to want," he said finally. Outside, the crickets were beginning in the grass. The summer deepened, and with it came the heat, a Kansas heat that was nothing like the mild, damp warmth of Irish summers, nothing like anything Maggie had experienced, a broad, dry, pressing heat that turned the sky white at midday and made the distant tree lines shimmer and ripple like water. She adapted slowly and pragmatically, as she adapted to most things, by taking note of what worked and doing more of it. She started rising at 5 in the morning, getting the hard outdoor work done before the heat settled in. She learned to keep a damp cloth nearby. She learned that the evenings, when the heat released, were so spectacular in compensation that she began to look forward to the feeling of the air changing, the long, slow, golden light settling over the grass. She and Marshall fell into the habit of seeing each other 3 or 4 times a week, sometimes at the store when he came into town for supplies, sometimes at the hotel's dining room for supper with Daniel when Daniel was well enough to join them, and sometimes at the ranch, where she began to help with the kitchen garden that he had correctly identified as beyond his abilities. The garden was in a state. She assessed it, the first time she came to help, with the same honest appraisal she would have given a basket of badly sorted laundry, identified what could be saved and what couldn't, and set about the business of it. Marshall worked alongside her without being asked, following her direction without apparent difficulty, and without the kind of small masculine resistance that she had been half prepared for and was pleasantly surprised not to encounter. He was a man who was comfortable deferring in areas where someone else knew better, which was rarer than it should have been. They worked side by side in the garden on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, the kind of afternoon where the sky was so enormous above them that talking sometimes felt like a private conversation in a public square, and Maggie was tying up the tomato plants which had gone sideways in the absence of any support, when she became aware that Marshall had stopped working and was watching her. She did not look up immediately. "If you are going to tell me I'm doing this wrong, now is the time." "You're not doing it wrong." "Then what?" He was quiet for a moment. She looked up then and found him standing 3 feet from her with the afternoon light full on his face, and an expression she had not seen before on him, open and careful at the same time, the look of a man who has come to the edge of something and is deciding whether to step. "I'm glad you came," he said. "I'm sorry it was so far." Something in her chest moved, slow and warm, like the first real warmth of a fire in a cold room. "You said that to me the first morning at the hotel. That you wished I hadn't had to come so far. I meant it then too, I just mean more of it now." She looked at him for a long time, with the tomato plants in her hands and the sun on both of them and Augustus asleep in the shade near the fence, and she said, "I don't regret the distance." "No, no, the distance was part of it. You don't know what something costs until you've paid for it." He reached out then and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear that had fallen loose from its pin in the heat, and his fingers barely touched her face, and neither of them moved for a moment. "I think," he said very quietly, "that I have been waiting for you for a long time, and I'm not talking about the letter." "I know," she said. "I think I have been moving toward you for a long time. And I'm not talking about the ship." He kissed her then, standing in the middle of the kitchen garden with the prairie stretching out in every direction, and the tomatoes finally getting the attention they needed, and it was a gentle, deliberate kiss, the kind that is not a question but is not quite an answer either. It is the moment just before the answer, the moment where both people agree that the answer matters. Maggie Hart, who had crossed an ocean and 11 days of rolling water and a continent of train track and 12 miles of Kansas prairie in a wagon with a man named Pete who did not speak, stood in a kitchen garden and kissed Marshall Sawyer and thought, with a clarity that was almost funny in its simplicity, yes, this is it. This is the thing. The summer continued, and so did everything else, because life in Dusty Fork in 1874 did not pause for sentiment. There was the matter of the water rights dispute between two of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Calhoun who owned land to the north, and a man named Reed who owned land to the east, which had been simmering for 2 years and boiled over in July in the form of a physical confrontation at the saloon that resulted in a broken nose, 2 broken chairs, and the necessity of the town's de facto sheriff. A man named Bert Caldwell, who was technically the marshal but who served in a primarily administrative capacity and was not constituted for excitement, sending a telegraph to the county seat for a more formal intervention. This affected Marshall because Calhoun, in the course of the dispute, had diverted water from the creek upstream, and Sawyer Creek's reliable year-round flow had become, temporarily, unreliable. Marshall handled this with a patience that she found both admirable and occasionally difficult to watch. He rode to Calhoun's property and spoke to the man directly, without anger, laying out the situation with the kind of calm clarity that Maggie recognized as a practiced discipline. Marshall did not have a simple temperament, she had learned. He had a disciplined one, which was different and, she thought, harder. He had the kind of feelings that ran deep, and the kind of self-possession that kept them where they belonged until the time was right. Calhoun was not reasonable. Calhoun was the kind of man who had always gotten what he wanted by being loud and staying loud, and he was loud at Marshall in the way of a man who is not accustomed to being spoken to calmly. Marshall listened to all of it, said what he needed to say, and rode back without resolution. He came to the store that afternoon looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Maggie poured him a glass of water from the pitcher Clara kept on the counter, and he drank it, and she said, "Tell me." So he told her, sitting on the edge of the counter with his hat in his hands, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was done she said, "He'll back down eventually. Men like that always make a great deal of noise before they stop. I know. I just hate the noise in the meantime." "I know you do." She put her hand on his arm briefly, just the press of her fingers on the rough cotton of his shirt. "It will sort itself out." He looked at her with the kind of gratitude that is almost too heavy for a simple expression to carry. "You have a very steady way about you," he said. "Has anyone told you that?" "My aunt. She meant it as a complaint. I think you mean it as a compliment." "I absolutely do." The water rights dispute was eventually resolved in late August by the county surveyor, who came out from the county seat and determined, with the authority of measurement, that Calhoun had indeed been diverting water that was not his to divert, and Calhoun was required to restore the natural flow under threat of legal action. He did so with extremely bad grace, and the relationship between him and his neighbors did not improve. But the creek ran steady again, and the cattle drank and the garden thrived, and Marshall, when he told her, looked like a man who had simply waited for a problem to solve itself because he had known all along it would. In August, Daniel had a relapse. It was not as severe as the original fever. The doctor, a steady, methodical man named Henry Price, who had come west from Philadelphia 15 years earlier and had seen enough prairie sickness to recognize it clearly, said that Daniel's lungs had been weakened and were susceptible, and that this relapse was concerning but manageable if he rested properly and did not push himself. Resting properly was not something Daniel did naturally. Maggie moved out of the hotel and into the rooming house to take care of him, which Clara accommodated by adjusting her hours at the store. She sat with Daniel through the bad nights, the way Marshall had sat with him through the worst of the first winter, and she found herself thinking about that while she did it. About a man she had never met sitting up through cold, dark Kansas nights with her sick brother, not out of obligation, but out of the simple human response to need. She had crossed an ocean to reach a man who was that kind of person, and sitting next to her brother's bed with the lamp burning low, she understood fully and without reservation that it had been worth every mile. Marshall came every day. He came in the mornings to check in before riding out to the ranch, and he came in the evenings after the day's work, and he sat in the chair in the corner of Daniel's room and talked with Daniel when Daniel was well enough to talk, or sat quietly when he wasn't, or helped Maggie with the practical matters, carrying water, fetching things from the store, once riding 6 miles to the nearest farmstead with a proper dairy cow because Dr. Price had said fresh milk would help. He came back with the milk and a slightly beleaguered expression and said, "Mrs. Hennessy sends her regards and also several opinions about Daniel's recovery that I didn't request but received in full." Daniel, who was sitting up that day and feeling better, laughed for the first time in a week. Maggie in the doorway watched Marshall set the milk pail carefully on the table and say something to Daniel, quiet and easy, and she thought, "I have been watching this man for 3 months now, and every single thing I learn about him adds to the same picture. Not a complicated picture, not a contradictory one. Just a clear, honest portrait of a person who is genuinely good." She had not known many genuinely good people. She had known capable people and kind people, and amusing people and loyal people, but goodness as a defining quality, goodness that ran all the way through, consistent across circumstances. Whether anyone was watching or not, that was rarer than any of the others. And she knew it because she had been looking for it for long enough to recognize it when she finally found it. That evening, when Daniel was asleep and the rooming house was quiet, Marshall and Maggie sat on the front porch together in the last of the summer heat, the sky overhead going from dark blue to black and filling slowly with stars in the way that prairie skies did, which was unlike anything she had seen from Cork. Not a few stars pushing through the clouds, but thousands of them, impossibly dense and clear, as though the sky was made of something that let the light through. "I think I love you," she said, to the stars, to the night, to the porch, to him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I stopped thinking of it as a possibility and started thinking of it as a fact about 3 weeks ago, maybe earlier." She turned to look at him. He was looking at the stars too, but his face was turned slightly toward her, and in the starlight his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. "When exactly?" she asked. "The afternoon in the garden with the tomatoes." "That was 2 months ago." "I know." He looked at her directly now. "I was trying to be careful with it. It seemed like a big thing to say to someone who came as far as you came, who might still decide to go back." "I'm not going back." He held her gaze. The prairie was enormous and dark around them, and the stars were everywhere, and she could hear the crickets in the grass and the very distant sound of horses from the livery. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that you can say no, or not yet, or any variation of those 2 things, and it won't change anything I just said." "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me, Maggie Hart?" She had thought about this moment, in the way that a person thinks about things they want but haven't allowed themselves to count on. She had turned it over in the long summer evenings, and the early mornings at the store, and the nights sitting next to Daniel's bed. She had argued with herself about being practical and being impulsive and being brave and being foolish, and she had come to the conclusion, sometime in the last 2 weeks if she was being honest, that the argument was already settled. "Yes," she said, "I will." He let out a long breath, as though he had been holding it for longer than just the question. Then he reached out and took her hand in both of his, the same steady, warm hands she had shaken across a hotel breakfast table 3 months ago, and held it carefully. "I'm glad you came," he said again. "You keep saying that. I keep meaning it more every time." She leaned her head against his shoulder, And they sat like that on the porch with the stars overhead and the prairie all around, and the rooming house quiet behind them with Daniel sleeping and getting better. And it was one of those moments that a person recognizes even while it's happening as the kind of moment that will be kept and returned to for the rest of a life. The news of the engagement spread through Dusty Fork with the speed that small-town news always travels, which is to say that by the following morning Clara Whitfield knew before Maggie had said a word to her, and by afternoon every person who came into the store had something to say about it. Most of the something was warm and pleased. Mrs. Hennessy, when she came in for flour and heard the official confirmation, pressed both of Maggie's hands and said that Marshall Sawyer was the finest young man in 3 counties and had been wasted on that ranch alone for too long. Bert Caldwell, the town marshal, said congratulations with the genuine warmth of a man who was happy for other people, even when his own life had settled into something quieter than he'd hoped. Even some of the rougher elements of Dusty Fork, the men who spent their evenings at the saloon and their mornings looking like they regretted it, managed a respectful nod. Daniel told the next morning sat up straighter than he had in 2 weeks. "I didn't actually expect you to go through with it," he told Maggie, which earned him a look of such focused sisterly irritation that he immediately amended. "I mean, I hoped. I wrote that letter hoping. But I know you, Maggie. I thought you'd come out here and decide the whole thing was too much of my nonsense and go back to Cork." "I considered it," she admitted, "for about the first 48 hours. What changed your mind?" She thought about the breakfast table, the hat coming off, the words offered plainly without performance. "He said he wished I hadn't had to come so far." Daniel looked at her for a long moment. "That was it. That was the beginning of it. It told me everything I needed to know about what kind of man he was. A man who is glad something happened but sorry for what it cost you. That's a man who sees you properly." Daniel was quiet, then softly, "I'm sorry I got sick." "I'm not," she said. "Don't you dare be either." He laughed and coughed a little, and she handed him the water glass and told him to rest. The wedding was planned for September, which gave them 6 weeks, which Maggie considered was slightly less time than would have been ideal but considerably more time than a great many prairie weddings afforded, given that the frontier had a long tradition of practical courtships that moved at the speed of necessity rather than convention. The church was still technically under construction. It had been under construction for 3 years and appeared to have reached a comfortable equilibrium with its own incompleteness, but the frame was sound and the roof was solid. And the Reverend, a young man named Thomas Greer who had arrived in Dusty Fork only 4 months ago from Ohio and was still finding his feet in the frontier community, was willing and eager and had the kind of genuine pastoral warmth that Maggie appreciated. She wrote to her aunt in Cork. The letter took 10 days to get there and she would not have a reply before the wedding, but she wrote it anyway because her aunt deserved to know, and because writing the words down, explaining Marshall, explaining Kansas, explaining the feeling of standing on a prairie at night with the stars overhead, made them more real in a way she needed. She described him carefully. His steadiness, his patience, the books on the shelf, the dog, the way he had sat up with Daniel through the worst nights of a winter fever without being asked. She wrote near the end of the letter, "I know it seems very fast, Aunt Nora, and I know it seems very far, and I know you thought I was losing my mind when I left. But I think the mind I was losing in Cork was not the one I wanted to keep. The one I have here is better." The preparations for the wedding were a communal affair in the way that Dusty Fork did most things that required cooperation pragmatically, with minimal fuss and considerable practical efficiency. Clara Whitfield offered the back room of the store for the wedding supper. Mrs. Hennessy contributed a remarkable quantity of food. Reverend Greer practiced the ceremony with the seriousness of a man who understood that even a small ceremony on a Kansas prairie was, to the people inside it, the most important thing that had ever happened. Maggie's dress was a practical problem that became a small, quiet triumph. She had one good dress, dark green wool, which was entirely wrong for a September wedding in Kansas heat, and no means of acquiring anything finer without spending money she didn't have. Clara Whitfield solved this without drama by producing, from a locked cedar chest in the back room, a white cotton dress that had been her own wedding dress 20 years ago, which she had kept carefully and which fit Maggie with only minor alterations. Clara helped her with the alterations herself, over 2 evenings at the store with the lamps burning and the town quiet outside. "You don't have to do this," Maggie said. "I know I don't have to," Clara said, not looking up from the hem. "I want to. My husband would have liked you, I think. He liked people who were direct." Maggie was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for everything this summer, the job and the kindness." Clara's hand stilled briefly. "You came here all alone and did the work and never complained and were honest about everything. That makes it easy to be kind." She resumed the hem. "Besides, Marshall Sawyer is a good man and you're good for him, and I like to see things come out right. It doesn't always happen. Out here, it doesn't always happen." There was a weight in those last words that Maggie did not press on, but she heard it. The morning of the wedding, September the 12th, 1874, came in clear and cool with a sky the deep uncompromised blue that Kansas autumn produced like an offering. Maggie stood in the narrow room of the hotel. She had moved back for the last week, giving Daniel's room in the rooming house more space, and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. Clara's dress was simple and clean, white cotton, with a modest neckline and long sleeves that she had pushed up because of the warmth. She had her mother's earrings, small gold drops that were the one piece of jewelry she had not sold, because she had been saving them for something important and had known, even when she didn't know what the something was, that they were for exactly this. She had pinned her dark hair up with more care than usual, and she had, in a small concession to sentiment, pinned a sprig of dried lavender into it, which Daniel had acquired from somewhere without explaining where, and which smelled like Ireland, like home, like the summers of childhood when everything still had all its people in it. She looked at herself and thought, "This is the face of a woman who crossed an ocean. This is what it looks like when a woman bets everything on a feeling and is right." The walk to the church was 2 blocks down the main street. Daniel walked beside her, still slower than his natural pace, one hand on her arm, and the morning light was low and golden, and the dust was still, and for once the main street of Dusty Fork looked less like a collection of rough buildings, and more like the beginning of something. Marshall was standing at the front of the church when she came through the door. He was wearing a dark coat she had not seen before, clean and properly fitted, and he had found a white shirt and a narrow black string tie, and he had shaved that morning with unusual attention to the results. He looked, in the plain, honest light of that September morning, like a man who knew that this was the most important thing he had ever done, and was treating it with the full seriousness it deserved. When he saw her, he went very still. She walked down the short aisle between the 2 rows of wooden pews, Clara on one side, Mrs. Hennessy, Bert Caldwell, Pete from the wagon livery, Tommy Aldred, Dr. Price, a dozen others who had been part of the summer without her always knowing their names, but who had become, in their aggregate, the community she was marrying into. And she kept her eyes on Marshall's face, and his eyes did not leave hers. She reached him, and Daniel gave her hand to him, and Marshall's hand closed around hers, and Reverend Greer began the words that would make them. She said her vows clearly, in her Irish voice that had not softened at all despite the summer, and she meant every syllable of them. And when Marshall said his in his low, steady voice, she heard the same absolute meaning underneath and felt it in her chest like a bell rung in a still room. When Reverend Greer said that the man might kiss his wife, Marshall turned to her and took her face in his hands, very gently, and kissed her in front of every person in that half-finished church on the Kansas Prairie. And it was the same as the first kiss in the garden and entirely different, because this time it was the answer to everything. The supper at Clara's store lasted well into the evening. There was food and warmth and noise and toasting, Daniel on his feet, and looking better than he had in months, the happiness of the occasion doing for him what weeks of rest had been unable to fully accomplish. Pete, the wagon driver, gave a toast that consisted entirely of good, good people, and sat down, and somehow it was the most moved anyone was all evening. Maggie and Marshall rode back to the ranch in the evening, in the wagon Marshall used for town trips, with Augustus running alongside in the grass at the side of the road, apparently having decided that he was not being left behind regardless of what the occasion was. The sun was down and the stars were beginning, and the air was cool against her face, and Marshall was beside her with the reins in one hand and her hand in the other, and the prairie was dark and enormous and beautiful around them in every direction. "Mrs. Sawyer," he said, testing the sound. "I'm still thinking of it as Maggie Sawyer," she said. "That works too." "Yes," she said, "I think it does." The ranch, when they arrived, had a lamp burning in the window. She did not ask who had lit it. She suspected Mrs. Hennessy had a hand in it, being the kind of woman who thought of things like that. Inside, the house smelled of the morning's wood fire, and the herbs she had hung to dry over the kitchen window, and something underneath both that she was already beginning to recognize as the specific scent of the place she was going to call home. Marshall lifted her trunk from the wagon bed and carried it inside, and she carried her smaller bag, and then they were standing in the kitchen with the lamp burning and Augustus settling himself in front of the cold fireplace with the immediate proprietary comfort of an animal who knows which house is his. "Are you tired?" Marshall asked. "No," she said honestly. "Are you hungry?" "Not really." She looked around the kitchen, the shelves, the good stove, the table. "I want to know every inch of this place," she said. "I've been coming here for months, and I always feel like there's more of it I haven't met yet." "There's an entire season you haven't seen," he said. "Winter out here is different, I've heard. It's big and it's cold and the nights are very long." "I've heard that too." She looked at him. "Daniel made Kansas winter sound like the end of the world. It's not the end of the world." He crossed the kitchen and stood in front of her. "But you'll want to know that you chose the right place before it gets here." "I know I chose the right place." He reached up and removed the dried lavender from her hair very carefully and held it for a moment. "This smells like somewhere else," he said. "Ireland, my aunt grows it." He set it on the kitchen windowsill in the fading moonlight that came through the glass. "Then it stays," he said. "As part of the house." She looked at him standing in his own kitchen on their wedding night with lavender from her aunt's garden in Cork on the windowsill behind him, and she thought she might love him so much that it was almost too large to hold. "Come here," she said, and he did. The autumn that followed was the education she had been missing all summer. Kansas autumn turned out to be its own astonishment. The grasses going golden and brown and rust, and occasionally a deep red that she had not expected from plains that spent the summer looking uniformly bleached. The sky, a particular quality of blue that seemed three-dimensional rather than flat. The air cool and sharp and smelling of dried grass and wood smoke from every chimney in every direction. She learned the rhythms of the ranch in the changing season. The cattle moving to the south pasture, the preparations for winter, the wood that needed splitting and stacking, the laying in of stores. She was not a passive participant. The laundry business had taught her organization and the sustained application of effort over time, and she brought both to Sawyer Creek Ranch with the same directness she brought to everything. Marshall did not try to exclude her from the work, which she appreciated. He explained the operations of the cattle, the rotation of the pastures, the management of the hay supply, and she listened and asked questions and learned what she needed to learn. She took over the kitchen garden entirely, which thrived under consistent attention in a way that it had not under Marshall's periodic and apologetic maintenance. She took over the household accounts, which she found were being kept in a notebook in Marshall's careful but not very systematic handwriting, and she set up a proper ledger system that made the numbers clear in a way that was immediately useful. "This is very organized," Marshall said, looking at her new ledger layout with an expression that combined admiration and a mild embarrassment. "The store accounts in Cork were messier than this," she said. "I had it cleaned up in a week. I have been meaning to get to the accounts. I know, the notebook says so. There are 3 separate notes to yourself that say sort out the accounts, and they are dated in 3 different months." He laughed, a full real laugh, and she loved the sound of it. Daniel came out to the ranch regularly through September and October, his health continuing its slow improvement, and the 3 of them fell into a comfortable rhythm of shared suppers and long evenings that felt to Maggie like something she had wanted without knowing she wanted it. Not just a man she loved, but a life that was full of actual texture and warmth. She wrote long letters to her aunt in Cork, and in November, a letter came back, the first she had received since her departure, and she sat on the front porch in her coat and read it with her heart in her throat. Her Aunt Nora wrote in her careful, close handwriting 3 full pages. She was well. The laundry business was well. She had taken on a girl to help who was competent, which was a relief. She had read Maggie's letters carefully. All of them 4 had arrived at once, a cascade of summer and autumn, and she had sat with them for 2 weeks before writing back, because she had needed time to think about what to say. What she said in the end was this: "I have worried about you, Maggie, from the day you were born, because you were always the kind of person who felt things very deeply and went toward them very honestly. And those 2 things together can hurt a person badly when the world does not cooperate. I think I was afraid for you your whole life, not because you were weak, but because you were brave in a way that could be broken by the wrong thing. Reading your letters about this man Marshall, I think you have found the right thing. I am not there. I cannot see it for myself. But I know your voice in writing, and your voice in these letters is the voice I have been waiting to hear from you. It is settled. Go well, my girl. I am proud of you." She was crying before she reached the end silently in the autumn afternoon, and when Marshall came around the corner of the house and found her, he stopped immediately, alarm crossing his face. "What happened? Is it Daniel?" "No," she said and laughed a little, wiping her face. "It's my aunt," she wrote. "She says she's proud of me." He sat down next to her on the porch step and she showed him the letter, and he read it slowly, with care, the way he read everything, and when he looked up his expression was soft. "She sounds formidable," he said. "She is absolutely formidable. She is the most formidable woman I have ever known, and coming from me that is a serious statement." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and the wind moved through the dry grass at the edge of the yard. "When this winter is done," he said, "and the spring roads are open, I want to build onto the house. Another room at least, maybe 2. She looked at him sideways. "That is a very practical statement. I have practical reasons. Do you?" "We're going to need the room," he said simply. She looked at him for a long moment, and then at the prairie, and then back at him. "Yes," she said softly, "I expect we are." He kissed her temple, and the sun was going down over the western horizon in its impossible lavish way, and the sky went orange and pink and that deep purple blue, and Augustus came around the corner of the house and sat at their feet with the solemnity of an animal who understands ceremony. The winter, when it arrived in November with the full force of its Kansas intentions, was everything Daniel had promised and more. The first blizzard came on a Thursday in late November. Maggie had been at the store with Clara and had seen the sky change in the afternoon, going from clear to that particular white-gray that she was beginning to recognize as the color of weather coming fast. She made it home before the storm closed in, riding the horse Marshall had given her, a steady bay mare named Birch, who was sensible in weather, with the wind starting behind her and the temperature dropping with the speed of something falling. By evening the storm was full, and the world outside the windows was nothing but white movement, and the ranch house was small and warm and sealed against it, the fire going well, the lanterns lit. The stock all moved into the barn and settled. Marshall had spent the afternoon doing the same preparations she had seen him do before each of the smaller storms of November, but with more urgency and scale, and when he came in from the barn, snow-covered and red-faced from the cold, he stamped his boots and accepted the coffee she handed him and said, with genuine admiration, "You have the house warm." I have been watching you do the fire all autumn, she said. I paid attention. They were snowed in for 4 days. The world outside was silent and enormous and white, and they were in it together, the two of them and Augustus, entirely sufficient. She read from his shelf of books Dickens, a history of the American West that she found both useful and occasionally bewildering in its confidence, a copy of Shakespeare's collected works that had been her husband's for 11 years, and had a number of passages underlined that told her things about him she would have known eventually, and was glad to know now. He read too, and they talked and cooked together, and played cards with a seriousness about the outcome that led to occasional disputes that were resolved through laughter, and slept through the long dark nights with the snow silent outside and the warmth inside. On the second evening, with the storm still going, he told her about his family. His father had been a farmer in Missouri, a hard man, not cruel but not warm, the kind of man who believed that difficulty was a form of instruction and that tenderness was a form of weakness. His mother had been the opposite, warm and quiet, and gone when Marshall was 14, taken by the same fever that took too many people in too many years. He had 2 brothers, both still in Missouri, both of whom he wrote to occasionally but had not seen in 6 years. He had left at 16 because the farm felt, after his mother died, like something that had lost its center, and he had gone toward the West because West was where there was still room for a person to define themselves by what they did rather than what they were given. "You were 14 when she died," Maggie said quietly. "Yes. I was 15 when my mother died." He looked at her across the table. "Fever also," she said. "There's a lot of fever in the world. Too much." She reached across and put her hand over his on the table, and he turned his hand over and held hers. "I think we carry them with us," she said. "I think they see us." He nodded, and she could see that this thought was not new to him but was welcome in the saying of it. "Do you think she would have liked me?" Maggie asked. "Without question," he said. "She liked anyone who was honest and direct and not frightened by work. You'd have gotten on like a house on fire." "Good," Maggie said. "I want the people who matter to you to like me." "Every person who matters to me already does," he said. "You've made sure of that without trying to." The winter continued, and she learned to love it too, the same way she had learned to love the heat and the storms and the enormous sky as part of the place, as part of the life, as part of what it meant to have chosen this and to mean it fully. She learned to move through deep snow with efficient confidence, to care for the animals in the cold with a calmness that came from understanding what they needed, to manage the fire through a long night so that the house was warm at dawn. She learned the particular beauty of the plains in winter, the way the snow made the landscape look simplified and vast, the way the stars on a clear winter night were so sharp they seemed solid. In December, she wrote to her aunt to tell her she was going to have a baby. It would come in the summer, by her reckoning. She had told Marshall first, on a cold, clear morning in late November when the snow from the first storm had packed down to a firm white crust, and the sky was a sharp winter blue. She had told him straightforwardly, because she did everything straightforwardly, and he had stood in the kitchen with his coffee cup in one hand and gone very still, and then set the cup down very carefully on the table and crossed the room and held her for a long time without saying anything. When he stepped back, his eyes were bright. "A baby," he said, as though testing the word. "In the summer, July, I think, or perhaps June. That is the best news I have ever had," he said, with the absolute simplicity of a man who is not embellishing but simply reporting. She put her hands on his face. "I think so too," she said. "She told Daniel at Christmas." He took it with the barely contained delight of a man who had been given much better news than he had been expecting, and he pulled her into a hug that was still slightly careful because of his lungs. And over her shoulder his face was the face of a young man who had written a letter in fever and illness, and somehow, improbably, gotten everything right. "I'm going to be an uncle," he said. "You are going to be an uncle," she agreed, "and you are going to be helpful and not insufferable about it. I cannot promise both of those things simultaneously. Daniel, I'll try. Spring came slowly, beginning as a suggestion in the quality of the light in February and growing into certainty through March, the snow retreating, the grass beginning to show its first careful green at the edges of the tire tracks on the road, the creek running strong with snowmelt. Maggie's body was changing in the steady, undeniable way of pregnancy, and she moved through the spring with the same practical attention she brought to everything, adapting what needed adapting without drama. Dr. Price came out to the ranch twice in the spring to check on her, and declared himself satisfied on both occasions, telling Marshall that Maggie was exactly the kind of patient a doctor preferred: sensible, honest about symptoms, and not inclined toward unnecessary alarm. Marshall had done the building work he promised in the late winter and early spring, working on the days when weather allowed, building a new room onto the east side of the ranch house, proper walls, a real window, solid floor with the help of Tommy Aldred, who turned out to be a competent carpenter under his general air of amiable incompetence, and a man named George Crow Horse who worked at the livery and was the best builder in the area. A fact that Dusty Fork had taken an embarrassingly long time to make practical use of because of the kind of injustice that was woven into how the frontier treated the people who had been there the longest. Marshall paid George fairly and directly and called him by his name, and treated him with the respect of a man engaging a skilled professional, which Maggie noticed and appreciated because she had seen enough of how it went the other way, in the town and on the roads, and in the way certain conversations went quiet around certain topics, to know that the other way was the more common path and the easier one, and not the right one. The new room was for the baby. Maggie painted it herself. She found some whitewash in the store and mixed it with a small amount of the blue she requested from Clara's paint stock, creating a pale soft blue that she applied to the walls of the new room over 2 days in early April. Marshall came in when she was finished, when the whitewash was dry and the afternoon light was coming through the new window, and stood in the doorway looking at the pale blue walls. "It looks like morning," he said. "That was what I was going for," she told him. "Did you know it would look like that?" "I hoped," she said. "It's one of my skills, knowing what things will look like when they're done." He put his arms around her from behind, careful of her changed shape, and they stood in the doorway of the morning blue room, and outside the window the spring prairie was green and enormous and full of light, and she thought, here it is. Here is the life. Here is what the whole journey was pointing toward. In May, a letter arrived from Marshall's older brother in Missouri, a man named Caleb, who had heard from their younger brother James that Marshall had married. Caleb's letter was cautious and somewhat formal, the letter of a man who had been out of the habit of warmth for long enough that it had become a conscious effort, but the warmth was there underneath the formality, genuine and reaching. He congratulated Marshall, said he was glad to hear it, said he would like to know her. He signed it simply, Caleb. Marshall held the letter for a long time after reading it. "Write back to him," Maggie said. "I know. Today." He looked at her. "You've read it. You left it on the table, and you have been looking at it all morning. What does he say?" He handed it to her and she read it, and she understood immediately why Marshall had been quiet all morning. The formality of the letter was its own kind of plea, not a dramatic one, not an easy one to respond to, but the plea of a person who had built walls and was now offering, cautiously, a window. "He misses you," she said. "We were not close as children. You are adults now. People can become close as adults. I promise you they can." She handed the letter back. "Write to him. Tell him about the baby. Invite him west. He won't come. You don't know that." Marshall sat down and wrote the letter that afternoon, while she was working in the kitchen garden, and she could see him through the window at the kitchen table with his pen and the paper, and the careful deliberateness of a man doing something that costs him a little. She turned back to the garden and gave him the privacy of it. He sealed the letter and walked into town to post it before supper, and when he came back he seemed lighter in the indefinable way of a man who has put something down that he had been carrying for a long time. "Done," he said. "Good," she said. They ate supper with the door open to the spring evening, and Augustus lay on the porch with the satisfaction of a dog in good weather, and the creek could be heard from where they sat, running full and clear, and the meadowlarks that had come back with the warm weather were calling in the grass. "I want to tell you something," Marshall said. "Tell me." "When Daniel wrote and said his sister was coming, I thought, I'm going to disappoint someone. I thought that's going to be some poor woman who crossed an ocean and a continent and is going to arrive and take one look at this ranch and one look at me and think, well, this was not worth the fare. And," she said, watching him, "and you arrived and I took one look at you, and the first thing I felt was that I did not want to be the reason you regretted coming. That's what I meant when I said I wished you hadn't had to come so far. Not that I wasn't glad, but that it seemed like a lot to ask of someone, and I was already afraid of letting you down before I knew anything about you." She was quiet for a moment. "You have never let me down," she said. "Not one single time since the morning I met you." "Maggie, not once," she said firmly. "I need you to hear that and keep it. You are the best person I know. You are patient and honest and kind without performance, and you read Shakespeare by yourself on a prairie for 11 years because you wanted to. And you sat up with my sick brother through the worst nights of a Kansas winter because he needed someone. And you told me on the very first morning that you weren't expecting anything from me, and every single one of those things told me who you are. I knew who you were by the end of the first week. I came here on faith, and faith turned out to be entirely correct, and I need you to know that and not forget it." He was looking at her across the supper table with the evening light on his face and the creek audible in the background, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it, stripped of the careful self-possession that he carried most of the time, simply present and moved and grateful in a way that he usually managed inside himself, invisible to the outside. "I love you, Maggie Sawyer," he said. "I love you, Marshall Sawyer," she said back, with the same straightforward certainty that she said everything. "Now eat your supper." He laughed and she smiled, and the evening meadowlarks kept singing. The baby came on the 3rd of July, 1875, which Dr. Price said afterward had been entirely straightforward, though straightforward was a medical man's word for something that Maggie had a great deal of more vivid and specific language for. Marshall was in the house throughout, not in the room because Dr. Price was managing things appropriately, but in the adjacent room and audibly in the adjacent room, which Maggie found alternately touching and slightly maddening, though she would not have had it otherwise. The baby was a boy. He was born in the morning blue room that Maggie had painted in April, in the first light of a July morning when the prairie was already gold with early sun, and he was healthy and loud, and had a startling amount of dark hair for someone who had existed for approximately no time at all. Dr. Price handed him over, and Maggie held him against her chest and looked at his face, this specific, particular face that she had not known existed until 30 seconds ago, and that she would now know for the rest of her life, and felt something that was larger than any category she had previously had for feelings. Marshall came in and stood at the bedside and looked at his son, and his face did something that she would carry with her, always broke open, entirely, in the way that faces break open when something happens that exceeds all preparation, all imagining, all prior experience of joy. He took the baby very carefully when she offered him, holding him with the attentive care of a man who is aware that he is holding the most important thing, and looked at him for a long time, and then looked up at Maggie. "He has your eyes," he said. "He has your chin," she said. "What do we call him?" They had discussed names but reached no firm conclusion, in the way of people who feel that naming is something to be done when the person is present rather than abstractly assigned. She looked at her son, with his dark hair and his complicated eyes and his absolute confidence in his own existence, and said, "Daniel, for my brother, if that's all right." Marshall looked at the baby. "Daniel James Sawyer," he said, James for his own younger brother, offered without her needing to ask, which was characteristic. "Yes, that's exactly right." She leaned back against the pillows, tired in a way that was the most complete tiredness she had ever experienced. And Marshall sat on the edge of the bed with their son named Daniel James Sawyer in his arms. And outside the window the Kansas prairie was blazing gold in the summer morning, and the meadowlarks were at full voice, and the creek was running. And Augustus was stationed on the front porch with the dignity of an animal who understood that something significant had occurred, and that his supervision was required. Daniel Hart rode out from town that afternoon. He came into the room with the expression of a man who was not going to cry, and then saw the baby, and then cried freely and without apparent embarrassment, and Maggie laughed at him and loved him completely for it. "He looks like you," Daniel said when he had collected himself. "He looks like himself," she said. "He's going to look like nobody else." Daniel looked at his nephew for a long time. "I didn't know it was going to turn out like this," he said quietly. "When I wrote that letter, I was sick and I was scared, and I thought, I need my sister. I thought about what Marshall had done for me, and I thought about you alone in Cork, and I wrote the letter not knowing what I was doing really, just hoping." "You did know," she said. "You knew Marshall was a good man." "Yes. And you knew I needed to find my way somewhere." He looked at her. "I knew Cork was making you smaller every year, and I knew that you needed space, real space, not just room." "The prairie has space," she agreed. "Does it suit you, truly?" She looked around the morning blue room, at the window with the sky visible, at Marshall standing in the doorway with their son asleep against his chest, at the lavender from Ireland still on the kitchen windowsill where she could see it from here. "It suits me better than anywhere I have ever been," she said. "It suits me like I was made for it. I just had to get here." In the autumn of 1875, a letter came from Caleb in Missouri. He was coming west. He had sold his share of the family farm to James, who was going to run it himself, and he was coming west with the intention of finding land of his own, and he wondered whether Marshall might know of anything reasonable in the Dusty Fork country. Marshall read the letter at the kitchen table and then read it again. Then he folded it and held it for a moment with the look of a man recalculating something he had assumed was fixed. Maggie, nursing young Daniel James at the kitchen table and pretending not to have read the expression on her husband's face, said, "Well, Caleb is coming. I heard. That's good news. He wants land near here. Even better news." "Maggie." He put the letter down and looked at her. "I haven't seen my brother in 6 years. I know. It might be complicated. It will definitely be complicated," she said with her customary honesty. "Most worthwhile things are, but it will also be good. You wrote to him and he wrote back, and now he is coming, and that is the direction of good things, not bad ones." He looked at her for a long moment. "How do you always know which direction things are going?" "I don't always know," she said. "I just look at the evidence, and I trust what I see." He reached across the table and touched her face, very lightly, the same gesture from the garden 18 months ago, now so familiar and so entirely his, and said, "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me." "You are the best thing that has ever happened to me," she said back simply, because it was simply true. Caleb Sawyer arrived in Dusty Fork on a November afternoon in 1875, stepping off the wagon from Hennessy with one large bag and the weathered look of a man who had been traveling for a week and knew it. He was 41, 10 years older than Marshall, broader in the shoulders and more obviously worn, with the particular tension around the eyes of a man who had spent many years being responsible for difficult things. He shook Marshall's hand, and then, after a brief hesitation that was visible to both of them, pulled him into a brief, firm embrace that was clearly outside his usual repertoire but clearly genuine. Maggie, standing beside Marshall, held out her hand when they separated. "Caleb." "I'm Maggie. Welcome to Kansas." He looked at her with the appraising look of a man who is trying to take a full measure quickly, and then something in him settled, some initial tension releasing, and he said, "Marshall wrote good things about you." "I should hope so," she said, "since they're all true." He laughed a surprised laugh, the kind that comes when something is funnier than expected, and Marshall, beside her, looked relieved in a way he was not concealing. Caleb met young Daniel James that evening at the ranch. the baby by now 4 months old and in possession of a considerable personality, and was visibly undone by him in the way that people who have not spent time around infants are undone, a look of slightly alarmed delight, an instinctive careful reaching, the discovery that something that small can hold your finger with that much determination. "He's something," Caleb said. "He knows it," Marshall said. Over the following weeks, while Caleb stayed at the hotel in Dusty Fork and looked at land in the area, he and Marshall fell slowly and awkwardly into something that might eventually be a brotherhood. Not the natural, effortless kind built on shared childhood warmth, but the deliberate kind built by adults who have decided to start again, which requires more courage and less assumption, and is in some ways more durable for it. Maggie watched this process with the attentiveness she gave all things she cared about, and helped it along in the ways she could, inviting Caleb to supper, making the evenings easy, giving the brothers time by herself, taking the baby on longer walks than strictly necessary. In December, Caleb found land 5 miles north of Sawyer Creek, 20 acres to start, good pasture, a small house that needed significant work. He bought it, and Marshall and George Crow Horse and Tommy Aldred and 3 other men from the area spent 2 weekends helping him bring the house to habitability, in the frontier way of community labor that Maggie had come to understand as one of the genuine goods of this kind of life. Christmas 1875 was at Sawyer Creek Ranch, with Daniel Hart and Caleb Sawyer both at the table, and young Daniel James propped in a wooden chair with blankets making him look like a small, dignified monarch presiding over the feast, and Augustus under the table occupying himself with whatever fell his way. The table was full and warm, and outside the prairie was cold and white under the winter stars, and the fire was going well, and the house was full of the noise of people who were beginning to know how to be happy together. Maggie stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching her husband at the head of the table, watching her brother and his brother talking about something that had made both of them laugh, watching her son wave one small fist in the air with complete confidence, and thought about the letter with the salt water stains on its edges, and the ship crossing, and the train across the continent, and Pete in the wagon with the sunset ahead of them. She thought about standing in that garden with the tomatoes and his hand barely touching her face. She thought about the stars over the porch, and the wedding morning and the morning blue room, and the word yes that had been inside her from the beginning, waiting to have somewhere to land. She thought about what Marshall had said to her that first morning. "I wish you hadn't had to come so far." She stepped into the room and sat down at the table beside her husband, and he turned to her with the easy warmth of a man in his own home with his own people, and she put her hand on his arm. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I was thinking," she said, "that you still say you're sorry it was so far." "I am," he said. "Every time I think about that journey." "Don't be," she said. "Not anymore. The distance was part of it. It made it exactly what it is. You can't have this without having come through that." She looked around the table at the people at it, at the house built by his hands and her planning and George Crow Horse's skill and the particular quality of their life together. "Everything I crossed to get here was worth crossing." He looked at her with the same open, present, entirely unguarded expression she had seen on their wedding night and the morning of the baby's birth, the expression of a man who has been given more than he expected and knows it and is not too proud to show it. "I know," he said quietly. "I know it was." Outside, the winter stars were at their fullest, burning cold and clear over the dark Kansas prairie, and inside, the lamplight was warm on every face, and young Daniel James was doing something with a spoon that delighted everyone at the table, and Augustus emerged from under the table to announce, in the way of dogs who find the current company satisfactory, that things were as they should be. The years that followed Sawyer Creek Ranch were not always easy and were never boring. The summer of 1876 brought a drought that tested every rancher in the county and required the kind of sustained, careful management that Marshall was built for, rationing the water from the creek with the same quiet discipline that he brought to everything. rotating the cattle with a precision that kept the herd viable when others around them reduced theirs, sitting with the difficulty instead of against it. Maggie managed the household accounts through the drought year with the focus of a woman who had learned what scarcity looked like in Ireland and was determined not to let it do more damage than it must. They came through it. Caleb's ranch grew. He was, it turned out, a better rancher than farmer, and the Kansas grass suited his cattle better than the Missouri soil had suited his corn. He was also, at 41, a man who was not entirely finished with becoming himself, and in the spring of 1877 he began a tentative and slightly awkward courtship of Clara Whitfield, which proceeded very slowly because both of them were cautious, and both of them had been alone for long enough to have strong opinions about their own arrangements. Maggie watched this development with considerable satisfaction and carefully refrained from involving herself except to invite both of them to supper at the same time on a regular basis and let the rest sort itself out. It sorted itself out. In the autumn of 1877, Clara Whitfield agreed to marry Caleb Sawyer, and did so in the now fully completed church, the 3 years of construction having finally reached their conclusion that spring, with a proper roof and finished walls and windows with actual glass, in a ceremony that was attended by every person in Dusty Fork with anything like a warm feeling toward either of them, which was most of the town. Daniel Hart's health continued its gradual and occasionally uneven improvement. He stayed in Dusty Fork, which Maggie had hoped for without pressuring, and found work in the general store when Clara handed that over to her new husband's management and took up a more substantial role in Caleb's ranch accounts. He was good with the customers and good with the stock list, and generally a person that the town was pleased to have, and he was an uncle to young Daniel James with the devoted thoroughness of a man who had created the situation and felt therefore both responsible for and deeply invested in its quality. In 1878, Maggie had her second child. A daughter this time, born in April when the Prairie was at the beginning of its green, in the same morning blue room where her brother had arrived 3 years earlier. They named her Nora, for the aunt in Cork who had lent her niece the money for the passage and wept on the dock and written her the letter about the settled voice. Maggie wrote to her aunt with the news the same day, and the letter that came back was shorter than previous ones and contained exactly the sentence she needed. Nora is a good name. She will be a good woman. I am coming to see her. The announcement that Aunt Nora was coming to Kansas was the single most surprising piece of news Maggie had received since Daniel's original letter, and she stood in the kitchen rereading the postscript 3 times before she was sure she had it right. Nora Brennan, 61 years old, who had never in her life been more than 40 miles from Cork, was coming to Kansas to see her niece's family. She would come by steamship to New York. She would take the train. She was entirely capable of managing and did not require anyone to fuss. Marshall told the news, said, "Your aunt and I are going to get along very well." "How do you know?" "Because she raised you," he said. "That tells me everything I need to know." Aunt Nora arrived in October of 1878, slightly travel-worn but entirely composed, and stepped off Pete's wagon in front of Sawyer Creek Ranch. Pete had been drafted into service as her transportation from Hennessy, and she had apparently determined by the time they arrived that he was, in her words, a sensible man, which for Aunt Nora was the highest form of praise, and looked at the ranch house and the prairie beyond it and the enormous evening sky, and said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, "Well, I see what you mean." Maggie laughed and hugged her and brought her inside, and Nora, the baby, now 6 months old and possessed of her mother's direct gaze and her father's steady calm, was produced for inspection. Aunt Nora held her great niece with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many babies, looked at her face for a long moment, and said, with the first visible softening of her expression since she had arrived, "She has your mother's mouth." Maggie had to step away for a moment after that. Aunt Nora stayed for 3 weeks, which was 3 weeks of Maggie watching her world through the eyes of the person who had known her longest, a strangely clarifying experience. Nora met everyone: Daniel, Caleb, Clara, Dr. Price, Reverend Greer, George Crow Horse, Tommy Aldred, Bert Caldwell, and the rotating population of the town and surrounding ranches. She assessed all of them with the brisk accuracy of a woman who had been managing other people's business for 40 years, and her assessments were, in every case Maggie was able to verify, exactly right. Marshall she assessed most thoroughly, in the way of someone who understands that the most important thing must receive the most careful attention. She watched him with his children, with his neighbors, with the ranch, with Maggie. She watched how he listened and how he spoke and how he moved through his own space. She said almost nothing about what she was doing because she did almost everything without announcement and Maggie did not ask. On her last evening, sitting on the porch with the autumn sunset going to work on the western sky, Aunt Nora said to Marshall, who was sitting on her other side with young Daniel James asleep against his shoulder, "You have made my girl happy." "She has made herself happy," Marshall said. "I've just been here for it." Nora looked at him for a moment. "That is the right answer," she said. "I was testing you." "I know," he said. "I could tell." She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "You'll do," she said, which from Aunt Nora was everything. She left on a clear October morning with the prairie grass all gold and brown around the ranch road, and Maggie stood in the yard and watched the wagon take her back toward Hennessy and tried not to feel how much space was left behind, and Marshall stood next to her and said nothing, because there was nothing to say and he knew that, and she held onto his arm until the wagon was out of sight. "She'll come back," he said finally. "She says she won't. It was a lot of traveling for 61. She came once," he said. "That means she might again." Aunt Nora did come back, 3 years later in 1881, and she brought a woman named Bridget who had taken over the laundry business entirely, and who was apparently doing very well with it and simply needed guidance on the accounts. Bridget was 23 and sharp and determined, and looked at the prairie with the same consuming, astonished attention that Maggie had given it 7 years before, and at Daniel Hart across a supper table with an attention of a slightly different but equally consuming kind. Daniel, who had spent 7 years improving his health and his occupation, and his general standing in Dusty Fork, without making any particular romantic progress, looked at Bridget with the expression of a man who has just received unexpected information that changes several calculations. Maggie watched this from across the supper table and said nothing. She simply made sure the supper was long and the coffee was good and the conversation was easy, and let the thing happen in its natural way. By the time Aunt Nora left in the autumn of 1881, leaving, this time, at the end of a longer visit, with the specific air of someone who has done what she came to do, Daniel Hart had asked Bridget Callahan whether she would consider staying in Dusty Fork, and Bridget had considered it with the directness of a woman raised under Nora Brennan's household and said yes, she would actually, and see how that went. She stayed. By 1882, Dusty Fork had grown to a proper small town, a second church, a schoolhouse with an actual teacher, a new hotel, 3 more stores, and enough people that Saturday evenings on the main street looked like genuine community rather than an assembly of people waiting for somewhere better to be. Sawyer Creek Ranch had grown to 120 acres now, a proper barn, a second well, a bunkhouse for the 2 ranch hands Marshall employed. The house had been added to twice more, 2 additional rooms and a proper kitchen with a stove that was the source of some of Maggie's deepest domestic satisfaction. And the kitchen garden that had started as a disaster was now substantial and productive, and tended by both of them on the long summer evenings when the light lasted and the air was cool. Young Daniel James was 7 in 1882, a serious, bright-eyed boy with his father's steadiness and his mother's directness, who had already decided that he wanted to know how everything worked and who asked questions without ceasing from morning to evening. Nora at 4 was herself entirely, vivid and decided and possessed of opinions that she expressed at full volume without hesitation, and who had taken after her father in no visible way, except that she loved the open land with the same deep constitutional preference for space, and could be found on fine afternoons sitting at the edge of the yard, staring at the horizon the way that Marshall had always looked at it, like the distance was a conversation she was having with something. There would be one more child, a boy named Caleb Daniel Sawyer, born in 1884, named half for Uncle Caleb, at that man's surprised and poorly concealed delight, and half for the gray tuncle in Dusty Fork, who had by then married Bridget Callahan in a ceremony at the now properly completed church that was widely considered to have been one of the finest occasions the town had produced. The third child came into a house that knew what it was by then, that had its own gravity and warmth and daily life as specific and irreplaceable as a person. And he arrived knowing he was wanted and slept from the start with the confidence of someone who has never had to wonder. On a June evening in 1885, Maggie Sawyer sat on the front porch of her home with her husband beside her, and the three children variously occupied, Daniel James reading at the kitchen table, Nora still outside in the last light, the baby Caleb asleep inside in the blue room which was now the children's room, the walls gone from plain blue to painted all over with Nora's contributions and Daniel James's careful drawings, and the handprints of three children at three different heights. Augustus was very old by then, white-faced and slow, but still present on the porch in the summer evenings, with the dignity of a patriarch who has earned his rest. He lay with his head on Maggie's foot, and she let him, as she always had. The prairie was doing what it did with the evening, the long, slow burning of the horizon, the sky going its elaborate colors, the grass moving in the warm wind in the long waves that she had never stopped finding extraordinary. 11 years in Kansas, and she still stopped what she was doing to look at the sunset. She thought she always would. Marshall was beside her with his coffee going cold in his hand the way it always did when he was looking at the distance, and she looked at him in profile, the gray coming into his dark hair now, the years on his face in the good ways they go on a face that has spent its time doing honest things, and she thought about a letter with salt water stains on it, and a woman standing in a small cork sitting room deciding whether brave and foolish were the same thing. "What are you thinking?" she asked him. Turned to look at her, and his face was the same face it had always been, the same face she had known across every table and every season and every morning and every difficulty and every joy of 11 years, and it was the best face she knew. "I'm thinking," he said, "that I'm glad you came. You always say that. I always mean it. Even now, more now than ever." He took her hand. "And I'm sorry it was so far." She shook her head slow. "Stop being sorry," she said. "I have told you this. I know, I can't help it. Every mile you traveled to get here was mine to travel," she said, "and I would travel every one of them again. I would cross the ocean again, and I would take the train again, and I would ride 12 miles with Pete who says nothing, and I would arrive in this exact town and walk into that breakfast room on that exact morning and meet you for the first time all over again. I would do every bit of it." He squeezed her hand. "That's what I mean," he said. "That's what I'm glad about. Not that you had to come so far, but that you did, that you were the kind of person who would." She looked at him in the evening light, with the prairie doing all its colors around them and the children in and near the house and the old dog on her foot and the creek running quiet in the background, and she said, "And you were the kind of man worth coming to. That matters just as much." He kissed her then, unhurried, in the long June evening, with the meadowlarks calling in the grass and the stars beginning to appear one by one in the eastern sky. And when she settled back against his shoulder, she felt, as she had felt for 11 years now in this specific place with this specific person, exactly and entirely at home. The letter with the salt water stains had brought her across an ocean and a continent and a 12-mile wagon ride to a kitchen garden in Kansas, and it had been the best journey she had ever taken, and she would not have shortened it by a single mile.